It all started with a letter taped to my front gate. Not mailed, not handed to me, just stuck there like a passive-aggressive warning. I remember standing there in the early morning, coffee in hand, watching my cattle graze past the old wooden fence line. Then I saw the paper flapping in the wind. At first, I thought it was another lost dog flyer or one of those local roofing ads. But no, this was something else. It was from the HOA, and it claimed that part of my land was now considered community property. Now, let's get one thing straight. I own a ranch. Not a townhouse. Not a backyard in a cookie-cutter suburb. A full-blown, multi-acre, fenced-off, deed-registered ranch. Been in my family longer than any of these neighborhoods have existed. I didn't pay HOA dues. I never signed any agreement. I wasn't even on their stupid mailing list. But apparently, none of that mattered anymore. According to this letter, the HOA had reassessed community boundaries and decided that the grassy stretch behind my equipment shed was now a shared green space. They wrote it so casually, too, like I should be thankful. This will offer all residents access to recreational land and a more inclusive community environment. Seriously? My pasture was not a public park. The first I left. I even texted a photo of the letter to my brother with the caption, "Guess we're a city park now." He told me to shred it and move on. And I would have, if that had been the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. 2 days later, I saw a couple walking their dog right through my southern pasture. No leash, no care. Just strolling through as if they owned the place. I walked over and asked what they thought they were doing. The woman waved her phone at me and said, "The HOA said this is our new trail." I told them plainly, "This is my land." That fence they just stepped over wasn't decorative, it was the property line. They left without a fight, but not without attitude. The guy mumbled something about calling the board. The woman said I was being selfish. I didn't even know these people. They didn't know me. But somehow, I was already the villain in their little fantasy. Then things got weirder. A week later, I saw a small laminated sign hammered into one of my cedar posts. Community access point, enjoy responsibly. Someone had drilled into my fence. That same afternoon, 3 kids rode their bikes straight through my ranch, laughing and chasing each other across the open field. And a man I'd never seen before was sitting on a fold-out chair near my livestock pens, eating a sandwich. I asked him what he was doing. He said, "Oh, I just came here for some peace and quiet. This open space is a real gift." A gift? From who? The HOA? I ripped the sign down and called the county recorder's office to double-check every line of my deed. Everything was clean. No easements. No right-of-way. No shared access agreement. The land was mine, fully and legally. Still, the HOA kept pushing. I started getting emails. Then came the printed newsletters slipped into my mailbox. "Let's all celebrate our newly expanded community space," one said. They even listed upcoming events to be held on what they were now calling the South Field, my field. The kicker? They had the audacity to mention light refreshments provided by HOA volunteers. That meant people were already planning to show up on my land with coolers and chairs, thinking this was some kind of picnic zone. That's when I realized they weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were doing this on purpose. And I wasn't about to let that slide. The next morning, I walked the fence line myself, just to see how far things had gone. Sure enough, 2 more signs had popped up overnight. One was staked near the eastern gate and read, "Trail entrance, open to all residents." The other had a map, hand-drawn, amateurish, and wildly inaccurate. It showed a loop going right through my pasture, around my pond, and looping back toward the neighborhood cul-de-sac. I stared at it for a long time. It felt like a joke, except no one was laughing. That night, I called a local surveyor I've known for years. When I explained what was happening, he paused for a second and said, "That HOA of yours is either delusional or trying to bait you." The next day, he came out, walked the property, and flagged every corner. He confirmed what I already knew. Not a single inch of my land fell under HOA jurisdiction. Not 1 square foot. I scanned and printed the survey, attached it to a short and direct letter, and hand-delivered copies to every member of the HOA board. I even highlighted the parts that spelled out the legal boundary lines, just in case they had trouble reading. I figured that would settle things. But if anything, it made them double down. 3 days later, I caught 2 HOA volunteers trying to install a bench under one of my pecan trees. They had a wheelbarrow full of tools and a cooler. One of them smiled and waved like we were neighbors having a block party. I didn't smile back. I asked them, politely at first, to pack up and leave. One of them told me they had permission from the board. I reminded them the board didn't own this land. Then I pointed to the freshly painted, private property sign I'd nailed to that very same tree the day before. That's when the tone shifted. The younger one muttered something about how I was anti-community. The other just scoffed and said, "You can't stop progress." Then they left, dragging the bench behind them like kids who'd just been told recess was over. After that, it wasn't just signs and walkers. It became a parade. People wandered through my property like it was a farmer's market. Some even brought folding chairs. I caught a group of teenagers fishing in my pond one evening, leaving trash and tangled fishing line behind. I found a family roasting marshmallows next to my old cattle gate, acting like they were camping in a state park. And just when I thought it couldn't get any more ridiculous, someone left a handmade flyer in my mailbox inviting all residents to a sunset yoga session on the open field by the pond. My pond. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't make a scene. But I did take notes. I documented everything. I kept copies of every flyer, every message, every time-stamped photo of strangers trespassing. Because at that point, I knew what I had to do. I started calling around. Fencing contractors. Agricultural suppliers. My county livestock board. If these people wanted to treat my land like it was a public park, then I needed to make it very clear that it wasn't and never would be. Within a week, I had a plan. Not just to protect my land, but to make sure no one could misunderstand where the line was ever again. I wasn't just putting up a few signs. No, I was going to put up something they'd notice. Something they couldn't ignore. Something that buzzed. Because when people won't listen to logic, sometimes you have to let the fence do the talking. If stories like this fire you up, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. There's more HOA madness and sweet justice coming your way. I started with the perimeter, measuring every post, every corner, every stretch of old fencing that needed replacing. My property was already surrounded by a decent fence, mostly to keep cattle in and coyotes out. But clearly, it wasn't enough to keep entitled neighbors from strolling through with yoga mats and picnic baskets. The fencing company arrived early on a Monday. The crew leader asked, "So what kind of setup are we talking? Livestock containment or people deterrent?" I said, "Both." He grinned and nodded like he'd heard this before. Maybe not from ranchers dealing with HOAs, but he understood the type of people who push until they meet something stronger than a "no trespassing" sign. We upgraded the entire line with reinforced wire, weatherproof posts, and solar-powered electrified wiring along the inside perimeter. Perfectly legal under county law as long as it was marked. And believe me, I marked it. Bright yellow warning signs every 10 feet. Electric fence. Do not touch. Private property. Large enough to read from a distance. Bold enough to make even the nosiest neighbor think twice. It didn't stop there. I added trail cameras in the trees. Motion sensors along the east pasture. A few new floodlights that kicked on at dusk and lit up the property line like a baseball field. I even bought a loudspeaker system connected to my phone, just in case I felt like giving a polite reminder from a distance. It sounds dramatic, but honestly, I'd tried polite. I'd tried paperwork. And I was done playing games. As the upgrades went in, I noticed the foot traffic slowed, but didn't stop. A few brave or clueless residents still tried wandering in. One guy, maybe in his late 50s, brought a folding chair and tried to set up near the pond again. He walked right past 3 warning, electric fence signs before he realized something had changed. When he reached for the top wire to climb over, he learned the hard way. He didn't get hurt, just got a good zap, enough to make him yelp and stumble back into the weeds. I was standing by the barn, watching quietly. He looked around like he expected someone to help or explain. I didn't say a word. He left in a hurry, chair dragging behind him. I haven't seen him since. The next day, I got an email from the HOA president. It was short and snotty. Your recent actions are creating a hostile environment for the neighborhood. We demand immediate removal of all hazardous fencing and lights. I replied with 2 attachments: the full surveyor's report showing the land boundaries and a copy of county code proving the legality of my electric fencing. My message? Nothing here is hostile. It's just private. You'll find both the law and the land are on my side. Did I hear back? Nope. Not a word. But that didn't mean they were finished. Later that week, I caught a man standing just outside the fence, taking pictures. He wasn't a neighbor, too well-dressed, too uncomfortable in boots. Turns out he was a lawyer hired by the HOA to document dangerous modifications. He never stepped foot on my land, though. I made sure the signs, and the very visible buzzing wires, did their job. He left without speaking. And I knew then, the HOA had no legal leg to stand on. They couldn't force me to remove anything. They couldn't find me. They couldn't even get close without risking a little zap or a confrontation with local law enforcement. But they still had one last card to play. I just didn't know it yet. It was quiet for a few days, almost too quiet. No emails, no flyers, no wandering families pretending to birdwatch in my pasture. I figured maybe the electric fence finally drove the message home. But then one afternoon, I noticed a line of SUVs parked along the side road near my back gate. That road barely gets any traffic, mostly utility trucks or the occasional lost driver. But this was different. These vehicles were clean, polished, and full of people who looked like they hadn't stepped in mud a day in their lives. They were huddled together, holding clipboards and folders, squinting toward my fence like it was some kind of science experiment. A man in khakis pointed at my surveillance camera. A woman in heels was writing things down like she was on a city planning committee. I watched from my barn, chewing the end of a hay straw and wondering just how far they thought they could take this. Later that evening, I found out. A thick envelope showed up in my mailbox, certified. Inside was a formal notice. The HOA was petitioning the county to reclassify the southern edge of my property as public access land. Their argument? That the area had long been used by the neighborhood for recreation, and that my fencing was a public nuisance and a hazard to community life. I almost laughed out loud. First, the only people who had long used that field were cattle, coyotes, and the occasional rattlesnake. Second, trying to rezone private ranch land with no easement or public deed. That's not just a stretch, it's fantasy. But what really caught my eye was the attached list of community complaints. Supposedly, residents were saying I was threatening kids, blocking nature trails, and hoarding green space. Hoarding green space. As if I was hiding it away in some secret vault. It was clear now, this wasn't just entitled behavior. This was a coordinated smear campaign. They couldn't win legally, so they were trying to win by pressure, turning public opinion against me, hoping the county would cave under the weight of enough angry emails. So I responded the only way I knew how. I called the county myself. Not just zoning officials, but also the sheriff's office, the recorder's office, and the land commission. I laid out the facts. Sent over every photo, every video clip, every fake sign they'd put on my land. I even gave them time-stamped files showing neighborhood events that had trespassed over my fence line without permission. One of the commissioners I spoke with chuckled when I explained the situation. "They want to rezone your ranch into a public walking path?" he asked. "Good luck with that." He assured me that as long as my land was properly recorded, and it was, nothing the HOA submitted could override it. Still, I didn't take any chances. I hired a property attorney. A good one. He drafted a cease and desist letter addressed to the HOA board, warning them that further attempts to misrepresent or trespass on my land would result in legal action. The letter was sent by courier and signed upon delivery. I made sure of that. But just 2 days later, a neighbor I barely knew knocked on my door. She looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. She said she'd been told I was suing the HOA and wanted to know if she'd be losing access to the community lake. I told her plainly, "Ma'am, that lake is on my land. You never had access." Her eyes went wide. She stood there for a second like she just realized something wasn't quite right. And that's when I started to understand what was really going on. The HOA had been selling a fantasy. One where my property didn't belong to me, but to everyone around me, whether I liked it or not. The next few days were a whirlwind. Word must have gotten around the neighborhood that the HOA had overstepped, because suddenly people I'd never spoken to were waving at me from their driveways. A few even came by to apologize, saying they had no idea the land was privately owned. One guy offered me a pie. Another neighbor, who'd once let her kids run wild through my fields, now crossed the street when she saw me coming. But as much as the tide was starting to turn in my favor, the HOA wasn't done stirring the pot. I got a knock at my door one afternoon, this time from an actual uniformed officer. Not the sheriff, but a young deputy. Polite enough, but clearly uncomfortable. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk about a property dispute. I invited him in and handed him everything. My deed, the surveyor's report, photos, videos, everything I had collected from the start. He glanced through it all, nodding slowly. Then he said, "The HOA filed a complaint. Said your fence is dangerously aggressive. They also claim you've been harassing residents." I stared at him, then burst out laughing. Not in a mean way, it was just so absurd I couldn't help it. I pointed out the signs, the legal compliance, the cameras. I told him if anyone had harassed anyone, it was the people trespassing across my land like it was a shortcut to their dog park. To his credit, the deputy understood. He said it was obvious I'd taken every legal step to protect my property. Honestly, he said, this looks more like a nuisance complaint than a real threat. He left with a copy of the documentation and told me I had nothing to worry about. Still, the HOA wasn't done embarrassing themselves. They tried sending one last letter, this time claiming that my electrified fencing violated community aesthetic guidelines. I didn't respond. Not even a one-liner. Because at that point, they weren't just wrong, they were grasping at anything to save face. The truth was, their narrative had started crumbling. People were talking. The woman who brought me pie said she remembered when the HOA president held a community vision meeting where he casually hinted at expanding shared spaces and reclaiming underutilized land. Back then, she didn't think much of it. Now, it was starting to look like he'd been laying the groundwork for this nonsense all along. Even worse, someone posted a video on the neighborhood Facebook group. It was footage from one of my trail cams, clear as day, showing two HOA members sneaking onto my land at night to post one of those fake access signs. The video blew up. People were angry, not just at the trespassing, but at how much time, money, and drama had been stirred up over a lie. The HOA scrambled to cover their tracks. The signs vanished overnight. The event flyers stopped. Even the boldest board members started keeping their heads down. It was like someone had flipped a switch. But what really sealed it was when I got a visit from a county official. Not a code enforcer or cop, someone from the Land Commission. He said they'd reviewed the HOA's petition, found it baseless, and formally rejected it. They have no authority over your land, he said. And they never did. He handed me a copy of the rejection letter, stamped and sealed. I didn't say much. Just thanked him and walked him back to the gate. The fence buzzed softly in the background, a quiet little reminder that this land wasn't anyone else's playground. And while the HOA was licking its wounds, I was already thinking ahead. Because once you catch someone trying to steal what's yours, you don't just let it go. You make sure they never try it again. The strange thing was, even after everything fell apart for the HOA, the failed petition, the exposed lies, the video footage, they still wouldn't admit they were wrong. Not publicly, anyway. There was no apology, no announcement, not even a simple update in their monthly newsletter to clear the air. Just silence. Like if they ignored it long enough, everyone would forget what happened. But I hadn't forgotten. I noticed something else, too. The same people who used to treat my ranch like a community park had suddenly developed an interest in fences and property lines. A few even started putting up new signs around their own yards: private property, no trespassing, keep out. One family that used to bring their dogs onto my pasture every weekend now had a fresh gate installed with a keypad lock. Ironic, considering they once accused me of being anti-neighbor. A couple of folks came to me, asking about surveyors and fencing contractors. One guy even asked if I thought the HOA might try something like that again somewhere else. I just shrugged. Because the truth is, once a group gets a taste of power, especially the kind they think they're owed, it's hard for them to give it up quietly. I learned later that the HOA president, the same guy who'd been pushing the land grab, had quietly stepped down. No farewell message. No vote. Just gone. Replaced by a woman who seemed more focused on sidewalk cracks than conquest. But his name still floated around in conversations. People said he'd been trying to add community access to his realtor pitch, selling homes based on nearby green spaces that didn't legally exist. When buyers started asking about the fenced-off ranch, the truth came out fast. I guess nothing kills a sale like an electrified fence and a legal boundary dispute. But I wasn't just sitting back watching things fall apart for them. I was planning my next move. See, the entire fiasco had taught me something valuable. If you don't protect what's yours, someone else will try to take it. And sometimes they won't come charging in with a bulldozer. They'll show up with smiles, flyers, and fake trail maps. So I went ahead and took it a step further. I had a second layer of fencing installed around the pond, lower, not electrified, but strong. I posted clearer signage. I updated my county registration to reflect the improvements and added a security disclaimer on record. Then I installed a few new cameras. This time with real-time alerts. I set up a system where my phone would buzz if anything crossed the line, human or otherwise. I figured if I was going to keep people out, I might as well do it smart. That's when something unexpected happened. One evening, just before sunset, I saw a teenager standing near the east fence line. He wasn't trying to climb it. He wasn't holding a fishing pole or a cooler. He was just staring, quiet, curious. I walked over, keeping a healthy distance. He didn't run or panic. He just asked, "Is this your land?" I nodded. He said, "It's pretty." I didn't know all this was private. I told him gently, "It always was." He apologized and left. And that, more than anything, proved how deep the confusion had gone. 4 months, the HOA had pushed this narrative that my land was public property. They'd sold the illusion so well that even kids believed it. It didn't make me angry. It just made me more certain I'd done the right thing. Because when your peace and privacy are on the line, the only thing more dangerous than people who don't respect boundaries are the ones who pretend they don't exist. It was around that time I started getting curious about just how far the HOA president had planned to go. Something didn't sit right. The fake signs, the community events, the survey map that magically included my land, it all felt too organized to be a simple mistake. So I started digging. Not out of revenge, but out of principle. If they were willing to try this with me, who's to say they wouldn't pull the same stunt on someone else down the line? Turns out there was more to the story. A friend of mine who works in county records helped me look up some recent filings. Apparently, the HOA had submitted a zoning suggestion months before the first sign appeared on my property. It was thinly veiled, titled something like Proposed Neighborhood Enhancement Expansion, but inside was a map almost identical to the one I saw staked into my pasture. My land was outlined in yellow, labeled Future Shared Space. That wasn't just bold, it was premeditated. Then I checked the HOA's budget filings. Guess what I found? An approved line item for community development signage, and another one labeled outdoor seating/park benches. And this was dated before they even sent me that first fake welcome letter. They weren't responding to neighbor requests, they were executing a plan. One they never even had the right to make. It didn't take much more digging to figure out why. The old HOA president, before stepping down, had just launched his own real estate service. I even found listings on his site advertising homes in the neighborhood with phrases like, steps away from open land and community walking trails. Except those walking trails were on my ranch. He'd been selling a dream built on someone else's property. I printed everything, copies of the budget notes, the zoning suggestion, screenshots of the listings. I handed it all to my attorney. He raised an eyebrow and said, "So, want to make this official?" I told him not yet. Not unless they came knocking again. But I wanted a record, a warning on file. Because no matter how quiet they were now, I wasn't about to pretend this never happened. That same week, one of the newer HOA board members, probably trying to do damage control, approached me at the local hardware store. He started with the usual small talk, then awkwardly said, "You know, not everyone agreed with what happened. A lot of us didn't know what he was doing." I didn't smile. I just looked at him and said, "Then maybe next time, speak up before someone has to build an electric fence." He nodded, then left without saying anything else. I wasn't trying to be intimidating. I was just done with pretending this was ever just a misunderstanding. It wasn't. This was a calculated land grab dressed up as community planning. And if I hadn't stood my ground, they would have taken full advantage of me and walked away smiling. Strangely enough, once word got out about the real estate angle, even the most pro-HOA voices went quiet. That Facebook group where people once complained about my harsh fencing suddenly turned into a place to ask about bylaws, board meetings, and election rules. Some residents even started showing up to meetings for the first time. I didn't go. I didn't need to. My land was finally being treated as what it had always been, private, legal, and not up for discussion. Still, every time I walked that fence line and heard the faint hum of the wires, it reminded me of something important. Boundaries aren't just lines on a map, they're lines that protect your peace. And sometimes, if you don't draw them clearly, someone else will try to erase them for you. A few months later, life on the ranch returned to its usual rhythm. The cows didn't care about HOAs. The fences held strong. The gates stayed locked. And not once did anyone try to step foot on my land again. But the memory of what happened stuck with me, not because of the drama, but because of what it revealed. See, this whole situation wasn't just about land. It was about control. It was about the kind of people who smile to your face while planning to take what isn't theirs. People who think rules apply to everyone else, but not them. And when they don't get their way, they call it unfair, even if they were never entitled to begin with. I've never been one to pick fights. I mind my business, work my land, and keep to myself. But that doesn't mean I'll let someone walk all over me. And when I think back to how casually they tried to claim ownership of what generations of my family worked for, it still makes me shake my head. Like they thought printing a fake map would somehow erase decades of sweat, paperwork, and fences. But what really gets me is how quickly some neighbors believed them. People who had never even spoken to me felt comfortable treating my property like a public park, all because someone told them it was okay. It was easier to go along with the lie than to knock on my door and ask a question. One of the few who actually did come talk to me was an older man named Carl. He'd lived on the edge of the neighborhood for almost 20 years. Said he remembered when the HOA didn't even exist, back when the area was just a cluster of dusty roads and scattered mailboxes. He told me, "You did what most folks wouldn't. You stood up when they expected you to fold." Then he added, "You saved more than your own land, you know. They would have tried it with someone else next." That stuck with me. Because he was right. If I hadn't drawn the line, literally and legally, what was to stop them from expanding again? Today my ranch, tomorrow someone's empty lot or pond or field. So I kept everything. Every letter, every photo, every video. I stored it in a locked file cabinet in my workshop labeled HO0. Not out of spite. Just as proof. Just in case they ever decided to forget how this all played out. And I noticed something else over time. More neighbors started respecting the fence. Not just physically, but in conversation too. They no longer made little jokes about borrowing the field for a party, or sneaking in a quick jog by the pond. They nodded when they passed. Some even waved. It wasn't about fear. It was about respect. About finally understanding that not everything beyond their street was theirs to claim. One morning, while feeding the horses, I caught sight of the HOA's new newsletter. Someone must have dropped it near the gate. I glanced through it out of curiosity. No mention of me. No more trail plans. Just gardening tips and reminders about trash pickup. That's how I knew it was over. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just quiet retreat and a rewritten agenda. And while they've moved on to more manageable targets, like mailbox heights and driveway colors, I still walk that fence line every week. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because it reminds me that peace isn't something you're given. It's something you protect. And sometimes, it buzzes just enough to keep the wrong kind of people from crossing the line. One early morning, just as the sun was peeking over the hills, I noticed a familiar SUV creeping slowly down the gravel road that bordered the west side of my ranch. It wasn't unusual for folks to drive past, but this vehicle slowed to a crawl, stopped for a good 30 seconds, then rolled forward again like they were inspecting something. I stayed back, watching from the barn with a cup of coffee in hand. I didn't recognize the driver right away, but when he leaned forward and glanced directly toward the fence, it clicked. It was him, the former HOA president. The same man who had tried to rezone my land with phony paperwork, false promises, and community pressure. He hadn't been seen around for weeks, maybe months. Some said he moved to a different county after resigning quietly. Others claimed he still lived in the neighborhood but kept to himself. And yet here he was. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't knock. He didn't even make eye contact when he noticed me watching. He just drove off, tires crunching over gravel as the dust trailed behind. I didn't feel anger when I saw him. Just a strange calm. Like I had already lived through the storm, and now I was just standing on dry land while the clouds faded away. Later that afternoon, I got a call from a local land appraiser I knew. He said someone had inquired about a small lot bordering the far end of my property, the same area the HOA had once tried to turn into a trailhead. The buyer asked whether the shared access was still active. The appraiser told him flatly, there never was shared access. That's privately owned ranch land, and the fence makes that clear now. That call confirmed something important. The story hadn't just gone quiet. It had spread. People now knew that the land was off-limits, and they knew exactly why. No one was pretending anymore. No more vague maps. No more rumors of public space. Just hard truth and steel wire. But the real win wasn't just in keeping the land. It was in something smaller, something quieter. A few weeks later, a new family moved in just down the road. I saw them unloading boxes and waved from my gate. The next morning, the father walked over, introduced himself, and said, "Hey, we heard about what happened with the HO. That was wild. Just wanted you to know, we respect the fence. No worries from us." That kind of honesty? That's rare. And I appreciated it more than he probably realized. Over time, things really did settle down. The cameras rarely triggered anymore. The signs stayed untouched. The electric fencing quietly hummed in the background like a warning that no longer needed to be spoken. I went back to focusing on the things I actually cared about: raising cattle, tending to the orchard, repairing old equipment in the shed. Life as it was meant to be. And while the HOA returned to its usual business, barking about lawn decorations and paint shades, I noticed that they never once brought up the issue of community land again. They had erased it from their agenda, from their newsletters, and probably from their memory. But I didn't. Not because I held a grudge, but because reminders matter. The gate still bears the same sign. The fence still stands firm. And every now and then, someone walks by, slows down, and glances toward the ranch with that look, the one that says, that's the land they tried to take. But they didn't. And they won't. It was sometime in late spring when I got a knock on my gate. Not my front door, not a phone call, not even a polite letter. Just a knock on the steel gate, loud and slow, like someone testing whether they really wanted to be there. I walked down the gravel path with my gloves still on, thinking it was maybe the delivery guy who sometimes got lost on these back roads. But no, standing there in khakis and a freshly ironed HOA polo was one of the new board members. A younger guy, probably in his early 30s, clipboard in hand, smile a little too forced to be genuine. He raised a hand like he was greeting a neighbor, but I didn't return it. I simply asked, "What's this about?" He cleared his throat and launched into the kind of speech that sounded like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Something about rebuilding positive community relationships, and open dialogue, and future integration of adjacent spaces. I didn't respond. Just let him keep talking while I leaned on the post and waited for the point to arrive. Eventually it did. "We were wondering," he said, if you'd be open to discussing a potential easement. Just for limited use. Maybe on weekends. For hikers or local nature clubs. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Not a mean laugh, just a surprised one. It was like watching someone step on a rake they should have seen a mile away. You mean, I said, you want to use my land, the land your folks tried to steal, and now you want me to let you borrow it, part-time? He shifted a little, trying to recover. We're just exploring ideas. No pressure. I stepped closer to the fence, not angry, not hostile, just firm. You all had your chance. And instead of talking like decent people, you tried to sneak your way into something that wasn't yours. Now you think repackaging the same bad idea with nicer words is going to change my mind. He started to protest, something about new leadership and not being involved in the past decisions. But I cut him off. Look, I said, I'm not your enemy. But I'm not your shortcut either. You want trails? Build them somewhere you own. You want parks? Fundraise and buy land. But this right here? I gestured behind me, toward the rolling pasture and the fencing that shimmered in the sun. This stays private. He got the message. Turned around, said, thanks for your time, and walked back to his car, the smile gone. It amazed me, honestly. Even after all the chaos, the legal warnings, the headlines, and the complaints they got from neighbors who saw right through them, they still thought they could inch their way back in. Like the fence wasn't a clear enough boundary. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't just about dirt and grass. It was about trust. And once that's gone, you don't get to knock and pretend it never happened. I watched his car disappear over the ridge and went back to my shed. There was a busted water line I needed to repair before the afternoon heat hit. As I tightened the wrench, I thought about how some folks never change. Not because they can't, but because they still think they're owed something. But not here. Not anymore. The land knows who it belongs to. And so does everyone else.